Today we will be looking at a case from the middle of the 20th century, so sit back as we go to Italy. Annamaria Bracci, who is known to everyone as Annarella, was born on the 15th of December 1937 to Ricciero Bracci and Marta Fiocchi. Her parents, who had been married in 1933, encountered difficulties in their relationship from the very beginning. They frequently argued and faced financial difficulties, which created an unstable home environment for the family. Annarella's mother was from a family with a long connection to the service of the papal army and had been raised by nuns, an upbringing that was supposed to instill in her a deep sense of discipline, faith and compassion. Annarella's father was not from such a heroic lineage and grew up in a modest home. He worked mending roads. However, despite their different backgrounds, they were determined to be together. Annarella was one of 6 children, and the family lived in San Lorenzo, a bustling and densely populated district in the eastern part of Rome. Although it was mainly inhabited by working-class residents, it had a vibrant community spirit, lively streets, and a strong sense of local identity. However, things changed on the 10th of June 1940, when Italy joined World War II. During this time, the city experienced significant turmoil, which resulted in the evacuation of many of its residents. The Allies launched bombing campaigns against strategic targets, which intensified in 1943. These were aimed at destroying Italy's infrastructure and military capabilities, but inevitably resulted in extensive civilian casualties. Historic landmarks, residential areas, and essential services were not spared, creating a perilous environment for the population. In response to the increasing danger, thousands of residents were forced to flee, seeking refuge in the countryside, other towns, or to the outskirts of Rome that was not subjected to so much bombing. One such area was Primavalle, a suburb located in the northwest of the city that had been developed in the 1930s as a social housing project to alleviate overcrowding, but had now become a refuge for the residents seeking to escape the Allied bombing raids. Annarella and her family also sought refuge in Primavalle. When the war ended in 1945, the family continued to live there, and in the following years, there was a series of rebuilding efforts in the neighbourhood, but focused on improving infrastructure and living conditions. Despite this, the area remained poor, and many residents continued to face significant financial struggles. In 1949, Annarella's father left her mother, taking her 2 younger brothers with him. This meant that Annarella, who was still just 11 years old, had to manage the household responsibilities by herself. Her mother did not cope well with the separation, becoming a nervous and frantic woman who, with no means to support herself or her children, turned to the streets for income. She would go out at night and often return with men so she could earn a few lira that would go towards buying food. The local people spoke of her immoral behaviour, and some wondered if Annarella would eventually follow the same path. But the young girl always sought to make money in other ways. She ran small errands for neighbours and consciously stayed away from her home as much as possible. This not only helped her avoid her mother, but also her eldest brother Mariano, who had become increasingly angry and violent after having his leg amputated following an accident. This made the household even more unbearable. Annarella's situation took a turn for the worse when her mother became involved with a local man named Adamo Moroni, a middle-aged street cleaner with a particularly shabby appearance. This relationship only increased the family's difficulties, which eventually led to Annarella's father accusing her mother of adultery. The situation culminated in a court case where Annarella was required to give evidence. Her testimony, which was straightforward and honest, deeply displeased her mother and further complicated their already troubled lives. Saturday the 18th of February 1950 was Carnival Day in Primavalle. The usually quiet neighbourhood was filled with festive excitement, but for Annarella, the evening held more practical concerns. Her mother gave her some money and instructed her to buy pasta, oil and some coal, as the children were hungry and needed to eat. She agreed to do as her mother asked, and at 7:30 p.m. made her way outside. It was already dark, and the roads and alleyways were only dimly lit. As Annarella made her way through the streets, she encountered her friend named Anna Chekin. They chatted for a while, mainly about the carnival and the excitement in the neighbourhood. She then continued on her errand, Later, she saw Leonello Egidi, a 25-year-old young man who worked as a gardener. He was an old acquaintance of the family, having once lived in their basement with his wife. Seeing that Annarella looked hungry, he kindly bought her some chestnuts. After this brief encounter, Annarella proceeded to buy the coal and the pasta. She knocked on the door of Signora Berengini, hoping to get some cooking oil. However, life was hard for most of the residents who lived in Prima Valle, and Signora Berengini could only spare some lard. Grateful for the help, Annarella thanked her and began her journey back home. But Annarella Bracci never returned. After a few hours had passed, Annarella's mother became very worried. She asked the neighbours if they had seen her daughter, but none of them had. Already a very anxious woman, she now felt a growing sense of panic. Where was her little girl? Eventually she went to the police station. However, they didn't seem particularly worried. After all, it was Carnival, and 12-year-old children would naturally want to enjoy the festivities. Additionally, protests in Rome were demanding much of the police's attention. Despite the police's indifference to her concern, Marta continued to search for her missing child. She walked along the streets and shouted her daughter's name, clinging to the faint hope that Annarella was at a friend's house and had fallen asleep or somehow just lost the track of time. As she passed each doorstep, she peered inside, but she had an unsettling feeling that something bad had happened to her little girl. She asked everyone who she encountered if they had seen Annarella, but no one had, and as the night wore on, her desperation deepened. The next day at noon, Marta returned to the station to once again report her daughter as missing. Now her plea was more urgent, her voice trembling with both fear and exhaustion. The duty officer, seeing the seriousness on Marta's face and the desperation in her voice, realised that this may not just be a case of a young girl enjoying carnival festivities. Something far more sinister may have happened. He told Marta that he would speak to his commanding officer and see what could be done. As the news of Annarella's disappearance spread, the local community came together to look for her. Among those assisting was Leonello Egidi, the man who had bought her chestnuts on the night she vanished. Despite their efforts, no one could find the missing girl. The police, however, were slow to act. They believed that she may have just run away, possibly to find work in another part of the city. They considered the young girl's impoverished life, with a mother who earned money through immoral means, were factors that might have driven her to leave. But as days passed with no sign of Annarella, frustration grew amongst the residents of Prima Valle. It wasn't until the 23rd of February, when Rizziero Bracci, Annarella's father, went to the police station that they finally took action. His emotional plea convinced them to send officers to assist in the search and open an official investigation. But it was now 5 days since the young girl had left her house to buy coal, cooking oil and pasta. The entire neighbourhood was on edge, gripped by fear and anxiety over what fate might have befallen the poor child. The media soon heard of the disappearance, and it seemed as though every newspaper in Rome reported the story. They turned it into a headline about a city struggling with crime and a police force who are unable to cope. Facing mounting pressure from both the public and the press, the police commissioner declared that finding 12-year-old Annarella Bracci was now a top priority. Extensive searches were conducted in the neighbourhoods of Torre Vecchia and Monte Mario, but there was still no sign of the missing child. People wondered if she had left for another city, or had something terrible happened to her and her body had been hidden. Annarella's disappearance became not only the talk of Prima Valle, but the talk of Rome, with the whole city now gripped by fear and uncertainty. A local baron offered 300,000 lira for any information that led to finding what had happened to Annarella. The police focused their investigations on the family. Annarella's mother, Marta, was arrested and interrogated extensively. It was noted that she lacked an alibi for the day her daughter disappeared, and her nervous demeanour and inconsistent statements only highlighted the police's suspicion. They speculated that Marta might have developed a deep resentment towards her daughter following Annarella's testimony in the court case about Marta's alleged adultery, as this had publicly shamed Marta and strained what was already a fragile relationship. The police scrutinised her activities on the day of the disappearance. They interviewed neighbours and acquaintances, however they were unable to find anything of any real consequence. They then turned their attention to Lionello Agidi, a man who was known locally as the blonde boy from Primavalle. He was detained and questioned at the police station, but it seemed that the only evidence linking him to Annarella was that he had seen her on the night she went missing and bought her chestnuts. Nevertheless, this did not prevent the public from jumping to conclusions, and many believed that he was responsible for the young girl's disappearance. On the evening of the 3rd of March, Annarella's body was discovered at the bottom of a well. This tragic find was made by her grandfather, Melendero Bracci, who was very close to his granddaughter and who had been tirelessly searching for her in the nearby countryside since the night she went missing. He later declared to the police that his search was driven by a dream in which he heard the voice of his granddaughter calling out to him. This eerie guidance led him to the well, where the grim reality of her fate was finally uncovered. The area surrounding the well quickly became a focal point for both the community and the media. Residents of Primavalle, already gripped by fear and grief, gathered to mourn and pay their respects. The police cornered off the site to conduct a thorough investigation, searching for any clues that could shed light on the circumstances surrounding Annarella's death. The discovery of her body intensified public scrutiny and outrage, highlighting the community's demand for justice and the urgent need for answers in the face of such a harrowing tragedy. An autopsy was conducted that revealed the brutality of her final moments. The examination showed that she had been attacked with a knife, as there were 4 puncture wounds and several cuts in the back of her head. Marks on her right hand indicated that she had tried desperately to fend off her attacker. The presence of water in her lungs confirmed the horrifying reality that she had been thrown into the well while still alive and had then drowned. The advanced state of decomposition of her body further complicated the investigation. Forensic experts were unable to determine if she had been abused, leaving this crucial aspect of the crime unresolved. The uncertainty added to the already overwhelming grief and anger among Primavalle's residents. The community, which had held on to hope of Annarella's safe return, now faced the devastating truth of her violent death. The news of the murder spread quickly, intensifying the demand for justice and heightening scrutiny of the police handling of the case. Law enforcement were under immense pressure and vowed to leave no stone unturned in pursuit of the perpetrator, while the community mourned the loss of an innocent life taken too soon. The same evening, Lionello Agidi was arrested and now found himself at the centre of the investigation. Another person of interest was one of Marta Fiocchi's lovers, Adama Moroni. However, there was no real evidence that could put him with Annarella on the night in question, and his wife was prepared to swear that he had been with her all evening on the 18th of February. 5 days later, the funeral took place. Due to the family's extremely poor financial circumstances, it was funded by the municipality of Rome. Annarella's coffin was carried in a carriage, pulled by a team of white horses. It was a solemn procession, which included some of Rome's most important figures, and was followed by an enormous crowd, estimated to be over 100,000 people. As the city gathered in collective grief, there was an outpouring of pity for the senseless violence inflicted on a defenceless child, an act felt as a deep betrayal of trust. There was also much anger that emanated from a community that felt marginalised and abandoned by institutions that were meant to protect them. For the residents of Primavalle, Annarella's death symbolised the broader injustice they had to face on a daily basis, such as poverty, contempt and neglect. The funeral had sparked such intense emotion that it dominated the headlines in most Italian newspapers. Sadly, Annarella's mother did not attend the funeral because she was still being detained at the police station. Authorities believed that she might have been responsible for the crime, largely due to accusations from her son Mariano, who had reported his mother's mistreatment of his sister, and Marta had also made many contradictions to her statements during her interrogation. However, when talking to officers, Marta did tell the police about how Lionello Agidi had exhibited an unusual level of interest in her daughter. She said that he often approached her with various gifts, something that she was always concerned about, as she had considered it to be inappropriate, despite the fact that her family lived in very poor circumstances. He was already in police custody, and since the arrest, rumours had spread about how he had previously been seen speaking to young girls, and how he sometimes gave them gifts. People had also said that he had a disturbing reputation for mistreating women, including his wife and 2 sisters. The police continued to interrogate him, and despite his initial denials, on the 10th of March, he eventually confessed to the crime. He admitted to killing Annarella on the evening of the 18th of February 1950. He told officers that he saw her near a chestnut vendor, and after buying her chestnuts, she went to get cold pasta and lard. He then saw her again and invited her for a walk. He said that they headed to a nearby field and then sat down, but when she resisted his advances and started to scream, he struck her with a stick fitted with a nail, and after that she fainted. In a panic, he then threw her into the well. He went on to say that after that he went home, and later that evening the girl's mother knocked on his door and asked him to assist in the search for her daughter. Following the confession, he was taken to prison to await his trial. The trial began on the 30th of November 1951, and Leonello Aguidi pleaded not guilty. He retracted his previous confession, claiming it had been forced from him under torture. The trial lasted until February 1952, and culminated in him being found not guilty due to insufficient evidence. Some in the local community considered the verdict was just and believed that Leonello had been the victim of an elitist system who only wanted to convict someone for this terrible crime. However, there were still those who believed that he had indeed committed the murder. Soon after, Leonello was arrested again for attempting to abuse another girl during a local festival. This time he was found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Prosecutors then appealed his previous acquittal for Annarella's murder, and the court overturned the verdict, finding him guilty of killing Annarella Bracci, and he was sentenced to 26 years in prison. His wife vehemently protested the verdict. She described it as unjust and spoke relentlessly of his innocence. In 1961, the High Court overturned the decision, and he was released once more. Following this, the Aguidi family moved to Viterbo, a city about 80 kilometres northwest of Rome. However, Leonello's troubles persisted. He was arrested again for inappropriate behaviour towards young girls and sentenced to 6 more years in prison. Annarella and her tragic death gradually faded from public memory. As time passed, the intense media coverage and public outrage diminished, and the gripping case became a distant memory for many. The community slowly moved on, leaving Annarella Bracci's story in the past. Her death, though heart-wrenching, was eventually relegated to the annals of forgotten Italian tragedies. Annarella's mother continued to endure a life of severe hardship. Her son Mariano died in 1951, followed by her daughter Teresina a few months later. Of her 6 children, only 2 outlived her, adding to the many sorrows she faced. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.